Now we're going to get to the fun part, looking at how Enlightenment philosophers arrived at their conclusions by doing a thought experiment, something called Deductive Political Philosophy. If you look on the slide, the names highlighted in red are associated with the Enlightenment, and the names highlighted in green are associated with the Scientific Revolution. Notice on the timeline that these two movements overlap by quite a bit. They also influence one another quite a bit. On the right, you'll see a chart briefly outlining different Enlightenment philosophers and their main ideas, and they disagreed on a lot of stuff. But even though they all came to different conclusions about what government should do, what the ideal form of government is, what different rights should be, their thought process was the same, and it was a variation on the scientific method, which was being developed roughly around that time. So today you guys are going to be using that same thought process to think through society and government and see what conclusions you arrive to. The fancy name for what we're about to do is Deductive Political Philosophy, and you guys are going to be working out your own social contract theory. We're going to start with a quote by John Locke, which really brings to the forefront his approach, Enlightenment philosophers' approach really, to solving this problem. What does government do? What should society be like? How should we organize it? How can we make it more rational? Locke wrote, "To understand political power and derive from its original, we must consider what a state all men are naturally in." So what state all men are naturally in? And that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and to dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the laws of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. As sharp-eared students will recognize that description as being of the state of nature. Ideally, you have already mastered these 4 words. If not, I encourage you to take a snip so you can reference them as we go through the lesson. Human nature, meaning the way that people think, act, feel, etc., without any external law or government or anything like that to shape their actions, like naturally. Natural law is like the rule of the jungle, right? Like what rules do people normally follow without having to be told that these are rules and you have to follow them? Natural rights are rights that human beings are entitled to simply because we exist, not because the law says we get to have them as a nice treat or something. And the state of nature, super important for today, is an imaginary time and place, without government, without law, without any sort of formal society to shape the way that people behave. And the first place that Enlightenment philosophers began in trying to think through what the purpose of government is imagining a time and place without government. If we want to know what the value of this thing is, let's imagine life without it, right? Today, you guys are going to follow the same thought process that Enlightenment philosophers followed when they were trying to think through a rational form of government. Enlightenment philosophers started with their views of human nature, natural rights, and natural laws. What are humans like, and what do they naturally do? How do they naturally behave and interact with one another? What would the time and place like this be like? What would a state of nature be like? Next, they identified the flaws in the way that people live in this state of nature without government. Then, based on the state of nature they described and the flaws they identified, they defined the terms of the social contract, which ideally fixes the problem that exists in the state of nature. And from there, they tried to think of an ideal government that would be capable of fixing those flaws. Our overall goal is for you guys to be able to discuss Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau's views on government and on human nature and on life generally. And this seems very arcane, but it's actually super important for you in understanding politics from this point in history moving forward. These 3 men's view on government shape modern politics more than anything else because they don't agree. And in that disagreement, you get roughly 3 key archetypal views of people and government that still explain political divides. Even today, if you take almost any debate on the news on political issues, most arguments come down to whether a person arguing agrees with Hobbes or Locke, and sometimes Rousseau, less so in America though, on human nature and on the purpose of government. For example, should government be mostly about protecting people's individual freedoms? Or should it be more about protecting the community, like protecting people from each other? Do people need to be protected from each other? These kinds of questions we can use these 3 Enlightenment philosophers to start to answer. Our first step is for you to imagine the state of nature on your own. So if you're in my class, you have a handout that looks like this. If not, you can just number your page and follow along anyway. Please pause after I read each question and come up with your own answer. One of the best ways to understand society, especially for high school students, is to imagine a school as this like hypothetical society and reason through it. And that's what we're about to do. So imagine school as a society. We all live there. Now imagine we do away with all rules, all structures, and all authority figures forever. Essentially, we are at school with people that you know, but there are no social norms or constraints restricting people's behavior or telling them how to act. There are no consequences for anything. There are no positive incentives either. First, describe what you think life at school would be like without any rules, structures, social norms, or social constraints, both in the short term and in the long run. What would it be like? Would it be chaotic? Would people like generally figure out how to get along with one another? Would people take care of each other? Now pause here and just try to imagine like short term and long run. What would school be like? Second, identify and describe any guidelines or rules that you think people would naturally follow in this situation. For example, an eye for an eye. If you punch me, I'm punching you back. Or the golden rule. Do you think people would treat each other the way they'd want to be treated? So like, what kinds of consistent rules do you think would govern people's behavior when they don't have any authority figure telling them how to behave? Third, identify the factor that you think would most motivate behavior in this scenario. Would people mostly be worried about surviving and that would explain how they act towards one another? Would people mostly be worried about protecting their property or taking other people's? Do you think that people mostly have a sense of right and wrong, some sort of morality that would guide them to do the right thing even if they didn't have to? Explain why. Fourth, human nature encompasses the characteristics that humans naturally share and distinguish us from other species. Based on your description of this world without structure, describe what this implies about human nature. In other words, based on your description of how people behave naturally, what can we summarize about human nature generally? Are humans mostly tolerant? Are people social? Like, would people group together? Would they kind of isolate in smaller groups? Are people self-interested and greedy? Are people compassionate? 5. Describe any flaws that exist in this world without structure, and describe rules that could be implemented to fix these flaws. So like, what's the problem in this state of nature without authority figure or laws or anything else? And how could we fix these problems? Think about how to fix them in terms of specific rules. You know what school rules are like. Pick a couple. 6. Imagine that after living in this scenario, without any rules and structure for a while, we decide to go back to having rules and structure. What is the first rule that should be put into place to make life better than the world without rules or structure that you described in question 1? So if you could only pick one rule to impose on this imagined school as a state of nature, what would it be? Just for reference, in answering these questions, you have imagined a state of nature, you've imagined natural law, and human nature, you've started to poke at the purpose of government and perhaps at creating your own social contract. Let's go to number 7. In your opinion, in a world without government and without the rule of law, which we'll call the state of nature, rate where you stand on the spectrum from selfish to rational to compassionate in terms of human nature. What are people naturally like, based on what you just imagined for school? Are people mostly selfish? Do they mostly look out just for themselves? Are they competitive? Are people mostly rational or reasonable? Or are people mostly compassionate? Do they mostly care about other people and not wanting to see other people suffer? Based on your answers to all of these questions, why do you think that government exists? What is the purpose of government? And in the metaphor, government is like the authority figures in schools that have the power to impose rules. Number 9, how might assumptions about human nature, natural laws, and natural rights inform your views on the purpose of government? In other words, what's the connection between what you've thought about humans and their natural state, the rules they naturally follow? How does that inform your view on government? What's the connection? What is the purpose of government anyway, man? Who said you can tell me what to do? Such a teenagery question. I love it very much. Shortly after they were established, as we've seen in history, way back in the Neolithic Revolution, governments very soon became the tool of wealthy and elite groups in society, right? People who have the power to make laws tend to make laws that protect their power. They passed laws like the Code of Hammurabi that reinforced the superiority of these elite groups by having harsher punishments for crimes committed against the upper class. Similarly, laws passed during the feudal age in Europe in the medieval period were designed to keep order, but ultimately they preserved the superiority of kings and lords by exploiting the labor of peasants and serfs. Old news, right? While governments have certainly evolved in the 3,000 years since the Code of Hammurabi was passed, one of the common critiques of government has always been that they primarily serve the interests of the upper class people in society. However, this began to change in the 17th century in Europe with the rationalization of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And the way it began to change was that Enlightenment philosophers used deductive political philosophy to try to find a better way, an ideal form of government. Enlightenment philosophers, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, for example, all used baseline assumptions about human nature, natural laws, and natural rights to derive a hypothetical state of nature, to imagine a time and place without government and without the rule of law. The purpose of doing this, of imagining this world without government or the rule of law, was to determine the purpose of government. Next, they identified flaws in the way that people would live in this state of nature, the world without government or formal social structures. What's the problem without government? What problems exist? Then, based on the state of nature they described and the flaws they identified, they defined the terms of the social contract and tried to think of an ideal government that would be capable of fixing those flaws. The idea being that for government to be better than no government, the purpose of government should be nothing more than to fix the flaws that would exist if there were no government. These philosophers all had different views of human nature, and crucially, this informed their views of the ideal government because it set the tone for the entire reasoning process. And like I said, you guys basically did the same thing in that exercise at the beginning of this video. The social contract was the key piece of this reasoning, almost the conclusion of this reasoning. These philosophers, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, defined the mutual obligations that exist between an individual and the society they join, and or the government, in terms of a social contract, which is an implied deal between the government and the people who are being governed. In other words, between the people who have power and the people who are ruled over. The big question here is, what do individuals owe the government, and which rights do they give up to join society? And what does the government owe its people? Remember that this was all being established in a time and place with absolute monarchy, where the king thought he didn't owe the people anything and he was accountable only to his God. Under the social contract, differently, people give up absolute freedom or sovereignty in the state of nature and band together as a society and form the rule of law. In other words, in order to live together, we give up some of our individual freedoms that would make living together really difficult. This will hit home for y'all when you get married. For example, in order to live in the same apartment as my husband, I cannot paint my nails inside. It drives him nuts. That's a freedom that I give up to enjoy the benefit of our society together in this little apartment. There are benefits, though. In exchange, we expect something from the government. We expect the government to fix the flaws in the state of nature. The ideal government, according to deductive political philosophy, is one that helps enforce and maintain the social contract. The Enlightenment was all about trying to figure out what rights people should keep, what the purpose of government is, and what the social contract should consist of. So let's kind of see how this works using Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And first, think about where you land on the spectrum, right? So you can kind of evaluate their thoughts. In a world without government and without the rule of law, which we'll call the state of nature, do you think humans are naturally selfish and competitive or greedy? Do you think they're somewhere in the middle, kind of rational? Or do you think they're naturally good and compassionate? Bigger picture questions that you can think about as we go through this exercise. Do people behave because laws exist? Or do laws simply reflect the way that most people would behave most of the time regardless? Does your view of human nature influence how you think people will act without rules and structures? And what influences these views? What is it about the time and place you grow up or your own life experiences that leads you to think a specific way about human nature? Let's start by defining human nature for our three philosophers. Step 1 in deductive political philosophy. Starting with Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes thought that most people are naturally selfish and competitive or greedy. He would have been a 0 on that spectrum. He wrote, "Mankind is naturally wicked. The basic principle of life is selfishness. I put for a general inclination of all mankind, a perpetual and restless desire for power after power, that ceaseth only in death." So a very, very pessimistic view of human nature. He thought selfishness, wickedness, people are after power, and it never stops. John Locke, writing after Thomas Hobbes, in contrast, thought that most people naturally are basically rational, basically good, free, equal, and happy, most. He wrote, "Men, being by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. Men living together according to reason, without a common superior on earth, with the authority to judge between them, is properly the state of nature. And God, who had given the world to men in common, has also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life." Well, Locke would have been like around a 2 or a 3, 2.5, let's say. All the way towards number 5, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau thought most people are by nature good and compassionate And he thought that actually society, when people come together and join society, that's what ruins people, especially when private property gets introduced. He wrote that people have an innate or natural repugnance at seeing a fellow creature suffer. It is this compassion that hurries us, without reflection, to the relief of those who are in distress. God makes all things good. Man meddles with them and they become evil. Man is born free, and everywhere else he is in chains. Next, based on their view of human nature, let's see how each philosopher imagines the state of nature. What would life be without government based on what you think people are like? And then what's the problem with that vision? And again, if you're in my class, you have a copy of this. If you don't, I suggest you make one in your notes so that you can follow along. First, though, before I even get into them, see how much of this you can reason through yourself and predict. If man is greedy, what rules would they follow? What rights would they, be able to defend? What would a state of nature be like if every single person in it was greedy and selfish? What would the problem be? And what kind of government would be capable of fixing that problem? Oh, I forgot we did transitions. Okay. Let's start with Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, it's important to note, was writing during a time of chaos and civil war. I don't know if that totally explains his ideas, but it kind of helps. Thomas Hobbes believed that humans are greedy, selfish, competitive, and that the only natural law they follow is survival by any means necessary. He wrote, "Every man ought to endeavor peace, and when he cannot obtain it, he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war." In terms of natural rights, he thought human beings basically had the right to try to survive by any means necessary, and that was basically it. He wrote, "Every man has the right to do whatever it takes to preserve his own life by any means necessary, the right to act as judges in his own affairs, and the right to all things and possessions that he can acquire." Hobbes' state of nature, therefore, is chaotic, violent, one of total war, where anything goes. It's like a survival of the fittest, dog-eat-dog type of world. His description of the state of nature is famous, so I'm going to read it to you. He says, "During the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe or in check, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war is of every man against every man. The state of nature is a state of total warfare. There is a similitude of equality. No one is safe. Nothing is unjust. In the state of nature there is no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Sounds terrible. In terms of a social contract, we're looking for how to fix this problem of everybody's basically going to die. Hobbes' social contract has people giving up all of their rights, not some individual rights, all of their rights, to an all-powerful government, in exchange for which that government keeps them safe from each other, and that's about it. Hobbes thought, cutely, it is no use talking about a social contract because man won't keep any contract. The obligation of subjects to the sovereign is understood to last as long as the power lasts, by which the sovereign, the king, whatever, is able to protect them. So basically, we give up all of our rights to a super strong government that keeps us from killing each other. The purpose of government, then, for Hobbes, is to provide safety to keep us alive, right? And protect us from each other. This is kind of like the little seed that will grow into a lot of conservative ideology based on an assumption that laws shape people's behavior. If there weren't a law against murder, people would go around killing each other, is the idea here. The ideal government for Hobbes is absolute monarchy. And here you might be like, well, that's the government before, what's the big deal? There's a pretty important change. Absolute monarchy because that's the form of government with enough power to keep people from killing each other, says Hobbes. But legitimacy is different. A legitimate government for Hobbes is one that is strong enough to hold power. It has nothing to do with divine right theory anymore. It's just strength. Can you keep people from killing each other? Can you hold on to your crown? Cool. You get to be in power. Modern echoes of this line of thinking can be found, like I said, in conservative political ideology. Anything that assumes that people need laws to tell them how to behave because they can't behave otherwise. And later, kind of indirectly, capitalist economic systems, which are based on the idea that humans are by nature greedy and try to leverage that to a positive end to the extent that is possible. So pause here, record all of this in your chart. Our next Enlightenment philosopher was John Locke, who was writing after Thomas Hobbes in response to Hobbes and during a time when peace had been reestablished, so pretty different historical context. Locke believed that human nature was basically good, that people were basically rational, and that basically they would treat each other the way they would want to be treated. For natural law, then, he believed in what's called the golden rule, right? Treat other people the way you would want to be treated. In terms of natural rights, he wrote that the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches that mankind, being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So, in terms of natural rights, Locke believed that people had the natural right to life, liberty, and property. Put a star next to that because that specific sequence of 3 is pretty influential. In terms of liberty, what that means is people had the liberty to do what they wanted up to the point that it affected other people's natural rights. So you can't go infringing on other people's rights, but up to that point, if it doesn't bother anybody else, you can do it. Locke's state of nature, therefore, was relatively okay and yet imperfect. Locke believed that most people would follow the golden rule. Like the vast majority of people are rational, they would treat each other with some basic decency, and they would basically respect each other's life, liberty, and property. Most. However, as you guys probably know from experience, a few people just wouldn't. A few bad actors don't follow the laws of nature. And then what do? Those few people could ruin it for everybody. Society devolves into chaos without a justice system to fix it. So if most people are respecting other people's property, and then one person isn't, and he goes and steals a bunch of stuff, how do you fix it in a state of nature while also maintaining this like good, rational respect of life and liberty and property? Do you get revenge? Does that set off a cycle of revenge where like you punch that guy and then he punches you and then your friends get in on it? And then like suddenly we're in Hobbes's world. Locke doesn't want us to go to Hobbes's state of nature. So the problem in his state of nature for John Locke is basically we need a justice system to deal with the few people who break natural law to prevent chaos from taking over. And again, this is a pretty big difference between Locke and Hobbes. Locke believes that most people naturally respect other people's life, liberty, and property. Most people don't need a law to tell them to do this, to tell them not to murder other people. Most people just don't. But some people do, and for those people you need a system that is neutral that can punish them without dragging everybody else into a cycle of increasing chaos and retribution. Locke's social contract. We should probably put a big star next to this one because it was really influential in our government. For Locke then, People enter into a social contract to fix this problem of needing a justice system. People give up some individual rights and agree to follow the law. In exchange, the government must protect people's natural rights and provide a justice system through a system of law. If the government fails to do this, if the government fails to protect people's life, liberty, and property, then the people can and must overthrow that government through revolution and implement a government who will protect people's natural rights. This is hugely important to modern politics, and it is the language with which most really effective people assert and defend their rights. The natural rights of people limit the power of the government in this system, right? Because governments cannot impede on them. Governments can't just take people's life or liberty or property for no reason. The government has to protect those. But then that is also all that the government is supposed to do. The purpose of government then, for Locke, is to provide the system of justice and to protect natural rights, which for Locke, again, were life, liberty, and property. Crucially, law exists only to protect these rights. In other words, the law shouldn't regulate people's behavior any more than it needs to in order to protect the right to life, liberty, and property. This is kind of the genesis or the seeds of liberal political thought. Under liberal ideology, laws reflect norms. That means laws reflect the way that people behave normally. They don't shape people's behavior. I don't go around not murdering people because there's a consequence. I just wouldn't go around murdering people even if I could and get away with it, you know? Under this idea, people should be free up to the point where their freedom impacts other people's rights. So if I want to, well, I'm not going to put that on a video, but there are some pretty good examples that we can go through that kind of illustrate this difference between like my freedom to act and the Hobbesian idea that the government really should be shaping people's behavior through law. Anyway, the key thing to emphasize in your notes is the social contract and the purpose of government for Locke. For Locke, people give up some rights to follow the law, and the government must protect people's natural rights. A government that fails to do this is not legitimate and can and must be overthrown. The purpose of government is to protect justice and to protect natural rights. For Locke, the form of government that could do this was representative. And in his mind, he had England's constitutional monarchy kind of at the forefront, in which people's rights limited the power of government. However, this could take the form of a republic, perhaps, like the one that we have, maybe. In any case, this representative government, whether constitutional or parliamentary monarchy or a republic like ours, would base the legitimacy of government on the consent of the governed. That means the people give the government power. That's where legitimacy comes from. It's not divine right, it's the people. In terms of modern echoes, we can see the influence of Locke in liberal political ideology, and indirectly through socialist or cooperative economic systems that base the reasoning on this idea that people can be reasonable and people can cooperate for the social good. Finally, we get to Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing from the calm French countryside at quite a remove from Hobbes and Locke, but still responding to those other political theorists. Rousseau had a very different view of human nature. He believed that people are born good and happy and compassionate, that the most defining human trait is that when we see other people suffer, we want to help them. He believed that people are born good, and it's entering into society that ruins it, that like makes us bad. It's corrupting. Specifically, when people began to claim ownership of property, Rousseau argued, inequality, murder, and war resulted. According to Rousseau, the powerful rich stole the land belonging to everyone and fooled the common people into accepting them as rulers. Rousseau concluded that natural law then, in a state of nature, before society existed to ruin all this good stuff, natural law, what people would have naturally respected, would have been the right to self-preservation, like people would do what it took to keep themselves alive, tempered with compassion. People would also care about other people suffering and wanting to help. In terms of natural rights, people had the right to liberty, but also to equality, Rousseau believed. And this is tricky because often these two ideals are presented as a choice. You can't have both, or we're told to think in the modern world. Rousseau believed that we could, and we should strive to, both be free, but also be equal. Rousseau's state of nature, then, was one in which people were basically good and happy, but primitive. He imagined people basically like hunter-gatherers, or like the most idealized vision of Native Americans that you could think of from like a European perspective. Similarly, people were solitary, kind of like hunter-gatherers, right? So like people lived in small little groups, if groups at all. And this was actually a problem. Even though people were kind of content, this primitive solitary aspect to Rousseau's state of nature meant that people couldn't progress and achieve more sophisticated goals because we need to come together and work together to do that. And those goals could be in terms of like, you know, scientific progress if you want, but what he had in mind was more like assuring collective good. We can't work together for our common benefit in a state of nature where people are basically primitive and solitary. The problem for Rousseau, though, is like the alternative society he thinks of as a trap. He thought that as soon as people start coming together in groups and form civilizations, and maybe you remember this from like our early lessons in history, right after the Neolithic Revolution, that people start to think in terms of private property, and that creates hierarchy and inequality, and that creates exploitation and war and everything bad that we have in society. So that's the problem. To solve it, Rousseau's social contract is a little different. He believed that people should give up their rights not to like a king or an all-powerful ruler or even a representative government, but to the whole community. And people would then exercise what he called their general will to make laws for public good. General will is kind of a key word for Rousseau, and it basically means like what the public, what the population as a whole generally wants. You could think of it as majority rule if you wanted. The purpose of government for Rousseau was to promote this general will. What does the community as a whole generally want? But also promote freedom and equality, while being careful not to be corrupted by society and its promotion of private property. So complicated, right? The ideal government for Rousseau, then, if he wants like everybody's voice to be counted, right, was a direct democracy. And he had in mind like small states, because otherwise direct democracies don't work very well. For legitimacy, Rousseau, like Locke, believed that government found its legitimacy in the consent of the governed. The people who are being ruled over have to agree to be ruled over by that specific government for it to be valid. And then down the line, these views will find echoes in the philosophy of Karl Marx and communist political and economic ideas, but that's not like the only thing it influenced. Okay, so putting all of these Enlightenment philosophers together, you can see some really clear differences between not just their views of humankind, but also their conclusions about like how we should be governed based on how they think that we are. You can also imagine that context matters here. Hobbes wrote during a time of chaos and violence, and it shows. Locke wrote during a time when that chaos and violence had largely been resolved, and that shows. And Rousseau was like off chilling in the quiet French idyllic countryside, and like maybe he was a little idealistic as a result, who knows. If you look, you will see reflections of these three ideologies everywhere, not just in politics, but you can even think about classes. You can imagine, for example, like teachers exert power over students in different ways. Some teachers rely really heavily on discipline, right? If you believe that students are probably going to do bad things and they can't be reasoned with, then you rely pretty heavily on consequences. Other teachers believe that even teenagers are kind of reasonable. I'm one of these for what it's worth. And the goal would be to learn as much as possible while not harming other people's rights to learn as much as possible. And other than that, like, you know, people can get a little freedom. These teachers use like as few rules as they possibly can, as few consequences as they possibly can, while like appealing to students' reason to try to get them to do work. And actually, this is a great place for you to pause the slide and make sure you have all of this information in your notes or in your chart. Put a giant star next to Locke, especially his view of natural rights, his social contract, and the purpose of government, because these are going to be really, really influential in the political revolutions that we study following this sequence of lessons. And now that you've done that, try taking notes on these concepts on your own, and we'll check the key points in our next lesson. See how much of this you can summarize. I know that these are like big ideas, and the next step of big ideas when you learn them is to think about them, talk about them, and try to distill them to their essence. So pause the slide here and see if you can capture these ideas in your notes by filling in the blanks on your own. And then finally, questions for thinking about and then ideally talking about in class. If you have successfully learned this lesson, you should be able to describe the idea behind the social contract. But then what do you think about it? In order for society to function, what individual rights do you think people should have to give up? Which ones do you think are important for people to keep? And what rights should governments never ever be able to limit? We can start thinking about evaluating these philosophers. So like now that we know what they think, do you think they were right? Which philosophers' ideas align most closely to your personal worldview and why? To what extent do you agree with them? If you disagree with part of their logic, how would you correct it? And what do the philosophers you disagree with get wrong? Do you think, for example, that anyone is born inherently bad? Or do you think society makes people bad? If they don't choose to be bad, what makes people bad? What are bad people anyway? How does your view of human nature affect your understanding of the social contract, natural rights, the purpose of government and laws, and the ideal form of government? And does the ideal form of government always reflect human nature? What other considerations should go into what governments work best for different societies, like low resources versus high resources, tradition, religion, something else? Speaking of human nature, where does your view of it come from? What shaped it? Do you think that it really is fixed or unchanging? Or does it change depending on context or circumstance? Does everybody have the same human nature? These philosophers assumed yes. Do you agree? In terms of natural rights, what do you think they should be? Why can't the world agree on what human rights even are? Do you think people can change? Or are people basically the same their whole lives? And speaking of which, what is the purpose of law and punishment? Does it protect us from each other? Or does it serve to enforce the norms that most people follow anyway? To what extent should laws limit freedom?